Hello and welcome. Mental health is emerging a serious concern for lawyers across the globe. Today we have somebody who's willing to talk about it, and he's very well known in India. His name is Chris Parsons. Chris is a senior partner with English firm Herbert Smith Freehills. I think it's going to be very interesting to hear somebody so successful is going through this. Chris, let me first thank you for joining this talk. And I think in this pandemic, all of us, we have our own concerns, personal and professional. And anxiety and fear is a very common factor which can cross through different set of professionals, very successful set of people. And I think we are no different from that. And I am conscious that you have raised this topic multiple times on multiple forums. And you've been specifically a mental health crusader in multiple ways. How are you dealing right now, the current situation, personally and professionally, seeing the lockdown and COVID?
Yeah, look, thanks, Balbir, and also thank you for asking me. You know that I was slightly reluctant to do this interview with you because I'm not currently in a good place at the moment, but you kindly encouraged me, and so I was happy to do it, and so we'll see how we go. And so let me explain where I am at the moment. So I, for probably 20 years of my career, tried to cover it up, but I was struggling with stress, anxiety, and ultimately depression, which I tried to self-medicate in two ways, I guess. One was through working hard and probably too hard. And the second way was through alcohol, and so I used alcohol to try and deal with the anxiety that I was feeling, and the danger is, as I found, that if you have a sort of propensity and you self-medicate for long enough and in large enough quantities, the danger is you become an alcoholic, and that's what I became. Fortunately, that's currently in abeyance, and I'm what I guess would be described as a recovering alcoholic. But the underlying issues, I guess, bubble up from time to time. And I've explained previously that I had a very difficult relationship with my dad, and he struggled with being a dad, I guess. He was a very good husband, loved my mum very much, and did till, the time he died, which was a couple of years ago. But he struggled with children, and he struggled in particular with the fact that children came between him and my mum. So, and in particular, so there were three of us, and I was the oldest, and I was the only boy, and somehow I took the brunt in that sense, so that all of the emotional energy and affection and attention that she might otherwise have been giving to him, that she gave to me, he struggled with, and he was very jealous. And so I guess at best I was public enemy number one, and at worst, he just wanted me gone. He just wanted me out of the house and away as soon as possible. And so I grew up with this worldview of the world being a very difficult and dangerous and unreliable and unsupportive place. And so I had no affirmation from him. Anything I did didn't seem to make any difference. It was dismissed. And I took that worldview to school and to university and to work. And so I carried this burden of anxiety, this burden of not feeling good enough, a burden of shame, I guess, in some respects. And I was able, really through help from a doctor, psychiatrist, counselors, and ultimately medication. I'm absolutely convinced that medication saved my life. So I take a small tablet that helps the production of serotonin in the brain. And when they do tests on people with depression, the serotonin levels tend to be quite low. And doctors think serotonin is the chemical in the brain that affects mood. And so if your serotonin levels are very low, your mood is likely to be very low. And but this drug helps the production of serotonin, and it normally, and I'll come on to that, just makes me feel normal and be able to function in a very positive way. And I guess it felt as though everything was under control. I managed to sort of get on top of some of the challenges that I'd been struggling with as a result of my relationship with my dad. There were other different issues with my mum and things. So but by 2005, 2006, I felt as though I'd largely come out of that. And in fact, that nicely coincided with my role in India. And you know, I became chairman of the firm's India practice at that time. And there's no doubt in my mind, if I look at the last 15 years, that I've had that role. Visiting India 2 weeks every month, it very much feeling like my second home. I've made many really good friends in India, including you. But it felt like I was coming out of it. But 5 years ago, the depression returned, sadly, and that lasted, I guess, for about 3 or 4 months, and it's returned again, and it returned about a week ago, and I've been trying to think why it's come back this time, and so there are two thoughts around it, and it may well be in part to do with the pandemic that we're facing. You know, maybe that's about, maybe it's brought around memories of anxiety. It's brought about sense of not being in control. Because very much with my dad, I never felt in control. I remember he would come into my bedroom sometimes, and I remember one incident where I was reading with just a small 25-watt bulb. And I spent hours and hours in my room because I just used to try and keep out of his way. So the good thing was that I became something of a SWAT, and I learned to study and read and think, I guess. But the downside was that I was there because I was just frightened of him and I was hiding from him. And I remember once he came into my room and he said, "You're wasting my electricity." And he changed a 25-watt bulb for an 8-watt bulb. And I could barely see my books as a result of this 8-watt bulb. And maybe the current circumstances have just reminded me of that anxiety, that lack of control, that worry that the world is a difficult place. Maybe that's part of it. So that's one thought process. Now, the other thought process is that, as you know, Balbir, I end up doing some pretty extreme things for charity, and I've so far done I think 4 separate events, but the 2 most recent ones have both been in India. And so in 2015 I decided to walk mainly, but run a little bit, from Mumbai to Bangalore. So I did 42 kilometers a day for 30 days. So effectively, it was 30 marathons in 30 days. And at the end of that, you know, it's a sort of a wonderful experience. We talked a little bit just before you started recording about your mum's approach to life, and I think I had a little bit of a sense of that, actually, because during that time, those 30 days, life became really simple. And, you know, I had, you know, it was about the support of my team, the friendship and love of my team. It was about, you know, just finding the next dabba for some stuffed paratha. or some dal or something very simple. And at the end of the day, it was about, you know, the pleasure of frankly finding some hot water, because often we didn't find hot water. And we had to put that
Right.
that charger, that electric coil into the
Right.
into the
Yeah.
bucket to over a stick to warm up the water, and then I would use a jug. And in fact, there was something
Right.
wonderfully simple about that way of life that was enormously appealing. I didn't need to think about anything else. It was just this walk.
Right.
And
Right.
and you talked about your mum being contented because she has everything she wants. And I felt I had a little bit of a sense during that walk that I had everything I wanted,
Right.
everything I needed. And so when I finished it, and it was a few months after I'd finished it, that suddenly I started feeling down again. And I'll talk in a moment, if I may, about what depression looks like, just to share what that looks like, because I think people use the word depression sometimes as just having an off day or a bad Monday or something like that. It's much more than that, and I'll talk, if I may, a little bit in a moment. But I think coming down from the 2 years of training, the event itself, the fundraising, the affirmation that I received for having achieved, accomplished something significant, and all of that suddenly coming to an end and re-entering life, I think I found difficult. And I'm wondering whether the same thing has happened again, because, as you know, I came back from India, I guess, a month and a half ago, having cycled Kanyakumari through Bangalore and Hyderabad and through into Varanasi, and then to Delhi, and then ultimately up into Jammu and Kashmir. So I cycled the length of India. So 4,100 kilometers in 41 days. And I'm wondering a little bit whether a year of training, the immersion in the project, the fundraising, the hype, if you like, around it, the interviews that I gave and things, the event itself, which obviously was strenuous and tough, but also wonderful. But then suddenly the ending, I'm wondering again whether I've had the same reaction, this sort of re-entering normal life after something significant to me at a time when obviously the world is in a very strange place, a place that none of us in our lifetime have seen before, this sort of extraordinary lockdown. And I think, and then I'll mention one other thing, because this is my wife's view. So she understands the points that I've just made to you about why I might be but she wondered whether I came back, and I think that this may be helpful to people listening, that there's a danger, I think, that when we're sitting at home, we find it more difficult to value our worth, our productivity, and our contribution. And I think that there was a big part of that with me that, and a lot of this still, I'd love to say, my whole dad thing is gone, but it's still there lurking in the background, and this need to perform and to be seen to do well in circumstances where it's difficult to judge the contribution, I think is challenging, can be challenging. And so what my wife observed was that I threw myself into work, online work, with a vengeance that was unsustainable. And so she wonders whether actually the reason that I've got depressed again is because I was trying to do more than was sustainable for me. And I'm sure there are lots of people around the world and in India wondering, are they being productive? Are they being valued? Are they, all of these things. And these are, these are big challenges and big issues. And not that we've chosen to operate and work in this way, we've been forced to. So there's this whole piece of lack of control. And the great Indian thinker Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, he talked about the importance of having a sense of control in your lives. And this pandemic has exposed the fact that, there are some things we can control, but there's a whole bunch of stuff we cannot control.
Absolutely.
And the way this pandemic will ultimately pan out, whether there will be a second wave, whether we will find a vaccine. They haven't yet found a vaccine for AIDS and HIV, but they've been able to find ways to manage it. All of these things mean that there's a whole bunch of stuff outside of our control, which can worry. And I guess what I'm trying to teach myself is the lesson that I try and teach others is to focus on the things that we can control. We can structure our days in a way that's sustainable. We can try and make sure we have time, if we're fortunate enough to be living with our families at the moment, to make time for our families and things. And develop a habit that when we go to bed, that we can run off things that we're grateful for, rather than the things that we're anxious about, frightened about, or not in control of. So for me, it's trying to focus on the things that we can control rather than worrying about the things that we can't control. There's a very nice prayer that we use so I attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings as part of my recovery from alcohol. And we every meeting that I attend, we say something called the Serenity Prayer. AA has a notion of a higher power, and I happen to have a very clear notion of a Christian God, but it could be anything that you have. So your God becomes your higher power. And so prayer, if I may, I'll repeat it if I can remember it. But it's a short prayer, and it basically says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. The courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that's a very wise prayer, I think. So this notion of accepting there's stuff that you can't do anything about, and you need to be accepting of that, and to recognize that, to be brave enough to take on the things that you can change, and then to work out the difference between those two, so that you don't try and change the things that you have no control over.
Chris, I've heard what you said, and I think it can be very challenging when you have such a childhood, because we all, while growing up, see an appreciation from parents, and that's always very reassuring and give us confidence. And I think that's a foundation for our life, and that's true for everyone in our life. And if you miss that, then I think a lot of people struggle to get that acknowledgement and self-worth through their work, through their deeds. And I think that's a point which I can connect, that you have struggled to see that acknowledgement and worth through your work and through your deeds on a social front, and the extremities which you take up, maybe cycling for 30 days and going from Kanyakumari to Kashmir. So, and you have got your self-worth. Two questions I have here. One is, you've been very successful in whatever you have done, and you have gained a lot of friends around. You have a lot of assurance which has come your way. Your life is very comfortable. Do you think it should have changed your need for reassurance every time, or when you get out of one activity, you need to do something more to get that self-worth and assurance for yourself. And second, in your dad's episode, when for the first time you realize that you need some help?
Yeah, look, those are important questions. I would like to think that I have made a whole raft of steps in the right direction from this whole question around affirmation. And but I worry that it just rears its head from time to time. And however much you can, I guess the thing is this, that at least now I recognize what's happening, whereas before it was just a sense that I had to keep going, to keep achieving, to keep being, to try and be perfect, I guess, to try and prove my worth. Whereas when I start behaving in a way that I can see is seeking of affirmation, that at least I have a sense of where that's coming from, and that in itself is a helpful thing. Do I think I will ever completely rid myself of it? I suspect not, Balbir. I'd like to be able to say that I I would be able to do that. I suspect it goes very, very deep. You know, it was, you know, from a very, very early age until the time that I left home. And I guess in some ways it became more complicated because actually my dad and I had a pretty good relationship once I'd left home and once I had started working with Herbert Smith, now Herbert Smith Freehills.
Right.
Because he then was willing to acknowledge that I had achieved something and was proud of me. And so I then learned a different lesson, sadly, and that different lesson was that love was conditional. So I had to do something in order to be worthy of love. And so I think I've got two unhelpful things going on. One is a desire for affirmation that I'm still hungry for, despite the fact that I understand that. And secondly, this notion that, you know, you're only worthy, you're only lovable if you do something that is worthy of that. And rather than simply being enough in myself. And those are just horribly deep rooted, and things will just bring them, you know, they'll just come out of nowhere. And, you know, I wish they weren't there. And I wish I could, you know, sort of just pray them away or wish them away or push them away. But they rear their heads from time to time. And I just have to, I think the answer is I just have to manage them. And for a lot of the time, that means that I'm in a really super good place.
Right.
Just, you know, it's also the case that, you know, sometimes I'm not. And I, you know, the other great phrase in AA is this too will pass. So that good things will pass and bad things will pass. And, you know, and currently I'm not in a good place, but I know history tells me that it will pass, even though at the time it doesn't feel as though it will. And I worry about the cultural issues in India around mental ill health, and my guess is, based on stuff that I've read, that this pandemic is going to result in a very increased momentum, which will mean that people will struggle with all kinds of different issues, whether it's stress, anxiety, you know, lack of sleep, depression, you know, through to more serious mental health issues. And I know that there is a culture in India that regards mental ill health as a stigma. I know that families try and discourage people from getting help. I know
Right.
that. I know that can be a case because I've spoken to people about it, and I know that people, will almost say, don't bring shame on the family. It will pass. Do some yoga, do some breathing,
Right.
do some praying, and it will pass. And one of the things, one of the sort of extracurricular activities, I guess, Balbir, that I do as a result of my interest in this area is I joined a charity called MQ Mental Health Research,
That's
which is
right.
a mental health charity in the UK, and we commission research all around the world. And and I sit on the board of that, and through that I read a lot of research, and one of the things that I've learned from that, Rambi, is that human beings are remarkably adaptable.
Right.
And that they will adapt to tragedy, they will adapt to crisis, they will adapt to ill health, they'll adapt to pain and suffering, they'll adapt to loss, all kinds of things that they will ultimately adapt to. And we can all, I'm sure, in our own lives think of examples of people who've just been incredibly robust in terms of their ability to adapt, as people will adapt and deal with ultimately this crisis. But there are two things that human beings never adapt to. Number one is chronic pain. You never come to terms with chronic pain. And the other is, worryingly, is mental ill health. And so mental ill health needs to be dealt with. It needs to be addressed. You need help with it. So you asked me the question, when did I first get help? I first was beaten into submission in 1996, May 1996. And frankly, I should have asked for help. Frankly, needed help from a very young age. That's the reality. But I didn't, there wasn't a notion of, as a child that, you might be suffering. And in fact, actually, my parents weren't in a position to, A, they wouldn't have known what it was, and B, my dad wanted me out of the house. He didn't want me better. He wanted me gone. So the reality is I should have got help earlier. But I finally got help only because my body couldn't cope anymore. It was really my body giving up that meant that I asked for help. And I remember I went to the gym in 1996, in May 1996. I went down to the gym. I used to go to the gym in the evenings and then go back up to the office at a later stage. And I just collapsed and I was rushed to hospital, and I had every single test imaginable done. And the consultant said to me at the end of that week, Chris, there's nothing wrong with you. And that was the worst news, or one of the worst bits of news I've ever had, because I wanted something physical. I wanted something rare and exotic that I could tell people that this is the reason that I'm not well. And once that has been dealt with, everything will be all right. But of course, being nothing physically wrong, left only a mental health issue. And so at that stage, I asked for help only because my whole world had fallen apart. I ended up in bed for 3 months with a duvet over my head, crying. I didn't think it was humanly possible for a human being to cry for 3 months. But I did. And it was through, I guess, complete submission that I was then able to ask for help, counseling, medication, etc. And part of the reason that I've been so desperately keen to talk out on this topic is because I don't want people to get to that stage before they ask for help.
I agree completely. I think. How old you were then at that time?
I had, and I'm sure there's a direct link, I had just made equity partner and I was 34 years old, 34, 35 years old. So
Uh, uh, just one question here. I think once you are equity partner in a firm like Herbert Smith, which means that you have done certainly quite a lot of things right to be there, and you are financially and economically very comfortable on that front. And I believe you were married at that time. And so you're saying that in spite of so much assurance on this front, you still had these concerns and these bouts of depression and aloofness and whatever comes with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the great sadness around depression, of course, that it doesn't take account of what would otherwise appear to be everything being fine. In fact, if anything,
right,
it makes the position worse, because you're right, on the face of it, I had a good job. I'd just been promoted to equity partner, the ultimate goal, if you like, within a firm like Herbert Smith Freehills. I had a nice home. I had 3 lovely boys.
right.
On the face of it, you would have assumed that I was the archetypal success story.
Right.
And I think, that's the sadness with depression is that you can't see into somebody's mind. You can't see into their pain. And
Right.
whilst everything may look fine, it often isn't. And the danger is, I think, in the whole mental well-being space, is that it's very easy to be able to point at somebody else and saying, but look, they're all right, they're coping.
Right.
Why can't I? And of course, it looked like I was coping. It looked like I was fine. It looked like I had all of the attributes of somebody who should be fine. But it was a reminder to me, and a reminder, I think, that I share with people, that when everything looks fine, it doesn't mean that it is
fine. Right. No, I completely agree. I think I can get some sense that it's not necessarily what is outwardly looking fine, may not be internally fine. But I think you were at quite a critical juncture at that time. Newly entered into equity. How your firm handled it, or dealt with it rather. I'm sure it must be impacting your work in some way. You're dealing with your colleagues.
Yeah, look, that's a good question, Balbir. The answer is that in 1995, probably a little bit like India today, nobody talked about this stuff.
Oh, okay.
People were embarrassed to engage on this topic. I was embarrassed to engage on this topic. So the narrative around me going back was that Chris had been working too hard and needed to recharge his batteries. And that was a narrative that I was happy to support, because it was a narrative consistent with a successful partner who'd just been working too hard, rather than the narrative that said, actually, there were much deeper troubles. And so I went back to work initially on a sort of part-time basis. What I would say is that and again, I would say this from the research that I have read through MQ, that the vast majority of people make a full recovery from mental ill health. And so that, and so part of my story is a story of hope, that actually there is life after depression and things. For some people, it requires a much more radical reassessment of their life. And I fell into that smaller category of people for whom I needed to make a much bigger readjustment to my life. And so actually, that was the beginning of something that ultimately became my role in India, where I tried to identify the things that I was good at and the things that would give value to the firm, whilst at the same time not being triggers for getting unwell.
Right.
And there were aspects of lawyering that were triggers for me being unwell. So it was even in 96, even though that was the catalyst for some significant requests for help, medication, counseling, etc., it took still another 10 years for that ultimately to evolve into what became my role as chairman of the India practice.
Right, right. Is this assessment right that you've been extremely successful in India purely because I think your ability to connect with people? And in India, generally you find people, once you're friends with, I think they involve you in their personal life, their family life, you may be knowing their parents, you may be grandparents. And I think that's always a very reassuring thing for anybody to drill down that level in terms of relationship. Do you think, I think this is one of the aspects which made you so successful in India? You acquired so many friends, and it's not only the friends who are your friends, I think their families, their extended families, you are attending wedding all-arounds, you are collecting money for Indian widows. Do you think it was a sense of fulfillment for you to be in India and being so successful?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, and it's kind of you to say all of those things, but I do think that is part of it, a big part of it.
Right.
And again, I read a lot, and obviously around areas that I'm very, very interested in. I also love watching TED Talks, as I'm sure a lot of people do.
Yes.
And I was very struck. There were two particular TED Talks that I often refer to. One is a wonderful talk by a lady called, a researcher called Brené Brown, who did a TED Talk called The Power of Vulnerability, which is extraordinary, and told me a lot about myself, actually. So Brené Brown, The Power of Vulnerability. And the other one is What Makes a Good Life, which was and is a study undertaken by Harvard on what it is that's important to people ultimately in their lives in terms of achieving contentment and fulfillment. And what both of those TED Talks, because they refer to the underlying research that was undertaken, indicate that actually, you know, and the problem is, and I certainly would have put myself in this category when I was younger, is that this notion that if we can be famous or rich, or ideally both, that will solve everything, is a misnomer. And what both these pieces of research indicate is that connection and connectedness are critical. And so building a community of support is absolutely critical. So, and I remember the great thinker and also Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman talked about, you know, if there's one piece of advice he'd give to people in the world would be to build a genuine and deep network of friendships, because it will hold you in good stead for living a balanced and fulfilling life. And so I'm being very struck by that. And the link with vulnerability is this, that I found the more vulnerable I am willing to be, the more I'm able to use the word depression to describe myself, the more I'm able to use the word alcoholic to describe myself, the more vulnerable I am, and as a result of being more vulnerable, the more I can connect with another human being. And so that becomes very important to me, because that connection I've recognized is important in my life. And it's extraordinary that the more vulnerable you are with somebody else, they themselves will open up in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And it's in that moment that the connection is made.
I agree.
and that's where the trust, if somebody is, people bandy the word around about being authentic, but I think it is important. And it's around, are you, when you look at Chris Parsons, when you look at Balbir Singh, are you seeing on the outside,
right,
also happening on the inside?
right.
And if I simply walked around India telling people that, I'm the head of the India practice of a globally successful law firm, and you should work with me because we're a great firm and I wouldn't have got to the place I've got unless I was brilliant, there would be, I hope there would be far fewer people who wanted to engage with me. Whereas what I've tried to do, since I've had greater self-awareness, and that certainly fits with the period of time that I've been working in India, I've tried to allow people to see the outside reflecting the inside of me. And that I think I may have even used this expression to you in a message I sent, trying to get out of this very interview. I said, in a way, it's my very brokenness. And I am genuinely, properly broken. It's my very brokenness that actually, in some ways, gives me the strength to help other people, or at least that brokenness gives other people the sense that they're seeing something real and that they're not on their own. So, for every person out there who might be listening to this, might be kind enough to be listening to this, if they're feeling anxious, if they're feeling down, if they're feeling worried, if they're feeling financially insecure, if they're worried about their jobs, that's completely normal. It's completely natural. And it's okay. It's okay to feel frightened. It's okay to be worried. But this, so I guess a bit of a macro piece, if I may, just around trying to put this current extraordinary position in which we find ourselves in context. I was trying to think of, in preparing for this, I was trying to think of things that have happened in our lifetimes.
Right.
That have had, once we've been in the middle of them, that you and I would have regarded as significant, really significant. And what I try to imagine is that none of us unlike in films, none of us like to be in the middle of a story that we don't know the meaning of.
Right.
Particularly a story that's currently frightening.
Right.
And the story is currently frightening because we don't know where things will ultimately work out. We don't know what the longer term implications might be, either from a health point of view or from an economic point of view, or in this case, unusually in both. So we've got really big health concerns, we've got really big economic concerns. So the two things that I thought that had any semblance of similarity was one, the 2008 financial crash, which when we were in the middle of that, before we knew the end of that story, was a really, really big deal. And people were talking about the world that we knew coming to an end, and that we were going to enter into something that looked very, very different afterwards.
Right.
And that didn't come to pass. Now, it might have come to pass, it could have come to pass, but it didn't come to pass. But I just reminded myself that when we were in the middle of that story, it felt very different. And I remember, watching governors of Banks of England around the world, political leaders, economists, people from Goldman, really talking about a very, very significant problems in the world. And so that was one. And then the even bigger issue which came to mind was obviously the issue around AIDS and HIV. And just for interest and comparison, I went to look at the stats around AIDS and HIV, and I contrasted them with the information around COVID-19. And what I think the COVID-19 position is something like 3.5 million people have been infected around the world. I think it's around 3.7 million people have been infected around the world. And there have been something like 250,000 deaths. And of course, every death is a sadness to, you know, a mother, a father, a son, a daughter, a cousin, all of those things. So I'm not downplaying that. But the AIDS crisis brought 32 million deaths.
Right.
32 million deaths. And again, I just remember in the middle of the AIDS crisis, people were really frightened what that meant for them. We still haven't got a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. We do have ways of minimizing implications, and we manage the condition. And I know, of course, HIV and AIDS, the whole contraction process, it was different and all the rest of it, but it was a genuine world crisis that could have been addressed differently. And you know, this one is being addressed in this way, and the majority of governments around the world have done it in a way to minimize death. In contrast to Sweden, for example, where they've adopted a series of different approaches, but one of which is the sort of herd immunity, where a much larger number per 1,000 have died than in other Scandinavian countries. But the world could have adopted that approach. It could have adopted that approach. So I think, and of course, you know, we did emerge despite the sadness and pain of AIDS and HIV, and of course that's ongoing to an extent. And we did emerge despite the extraordinary economic shock of 2008 in a not wholly dissimilar position. So there's at least part of me that wonders whether actually you and I will look back in 5 years' time and this will have passed and the world will look remarkably similar. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is a different proposition, but I expect that the world will look remarkably the same. That would be, I'm not very good with crystal balls, but if I had one, maybe that's what my crystal ball would tell. Go on,
yes, I have 3 observations. So first is that, you know, I think in today's world, nobody wants to remain ordinary. Everybody wants to be known, everybody wants to be successful, everybody wants to be rich. And nobody wants to be seen vulnerable. I think that's the biggest disconnect I find, that the moment I think I share the same characteristics with the other person, and vulnerability is a very common trait in human beings. It's only about showing that whether you are vulnerable or not. And I think, as you're saying, you found your vulnerability as a connecting point when it came to your making friends in India and across the world. I think the moment we realize that, look, we are doing a particular type of work, and what we have achieved is not necessarily a point where we need to disconnect with others. I think that's very hard to imbibe, easy to say. And the second aspect, which I think is, we all work to achieve something. And the Hindu theory of karma, I think it's very hard to really practice, because we can't keep going working and not looking at the outcome, which is very difficult thing to really practice. But I think if we start looking at it from the point of view that nothing is in our control, and this COVID is a classic situation, whatever we are doing, whatever the experts are doing, whatever the scientists are doing, nothing is in our hand. And we are left completely in so-called the God's hand, that whatever is going to be the outcome. So I think this is the classic time when we can test this aspect of karma, that we keep doing whatever we know and leave it to God, whatever is going to happen. And third is, I think when it comes to the current pandemic, I think the sheer speed with which it spread, nobody was prepared. No country knew that it's going to engulf it so drastically in such a short span. So I think the sheer shock, I think, has brought a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression all around. And I think as you were saying, that the moment you finished your cycling in India, you were hit by this because you were not prepared for it. And no one from our side or anybody as a professional were prepared to deal with this. So I think that's one factor which is bringing a lot of anxiety in it, in my understanding. Now, it's very brave of you that you have come out so clear that putting your weaknesses in front of everyone. It's really a brave thing to my mind, and you're a very rational man. You can make a sense what you're saying out of your statements. But do you see that the younger generation lawyers who are currently going through this phase, they are the associates, they are trainees, they may be going out of law schools. Do you think there is any path for them to deal with this a little more constructively in your understanding? One, of course, I know you have said that this will pass. We all know that after 5 years, we'll be pretty much the same. Although I hope that certain good things on an environment front, on a pollution front, we try to keep those things intact and make our life out of something else rather than our usual life. But do you see, and particularly I believe that Law Society in England has come up with some kind of guidelines for younger lawyers to deal with alcohol aspect, and which is called alcohol policy to my mind, and to deal with this pandemic situation and not to worry. Do you see that there is a green light or silver line in that?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. So I think, so two responses, I think. One is that, okay, so I think that there's initially the point that I was making around recognizing the things that we can influence and we can control, and recognizing those things that we can't, and trying to the best of our ability not to agonize and worry and spend too much time focused on the stuff that we genuinely can't control. And frankly, leaving that to both, we are very much in the hands of governments around the world, and we're in the hands of scientists around the world who are working on this, and we're the hands of pharma companies and others who are looking at vaccines, and recognizing that that's a whole piece of stuff that's happening. And, we may approve, we may not approve, we may have views on it, but let's recognize that we can't make a fundamental impact on that and leave that to one side. So let's look at what we can control. And, some of the stuff we can control is, how we go about our day-to-day lives, how we structure our lives, how we try and maintain some boundaries between what we're doing at work and what we should be doing outside of that environment, and trying to make sure that there isn't too much of a blurring, because I think at this time, one of the dangers is we could spend all of our time working because those boundaries are blurred. And so I would encourage people very much to have boundaries. I think this is a super time to be reflective. I do think that is important, and to think about what's important to each of us in a way that I was able to do on my walk and on my cycle, when I started realizing that actually some really simple pleasures were incredibly important. And you talked about it with your mum, and not to lose sight of that, and to recognize that, to be chasing success, fame, fortune, to try and run away from ordinariness, which you nicely put, are natural things to do, but to read or watch or understand people who have lived long lives, who might tell you a rather different story around what is ultimately things. I do think that faith has got a big part to play at the moment. It's something that I have engaged with my Christian faith in a way more actively than I had before this crisis, and that I see as a positive thing for me. And I was very struck when I traveled through India of, you know, in rural India and in some of the smaller towns and cities, what an extraordinarily strong faith many people in India have. Yeah. And I felt that other faiths could learn a lot from Indians in the extraordinary outpouring of conviction and happiness that I saw around some of the temples and around daily rituals and things, which was very striking. So I'm not sure that so what is it about, so these youngsters, so that's one part of it. So it's about a time for reflection, it's a time to listen. That's the other thing. I think we're all very good at talking, but not so good at listening. You've probably seen, Balbir, that wonderful video, TED Talk that Bill Gates gave, I think in 2015, warning the world of today. He explained in 2015 exactly what would happen today, and I've never seen a more prescient piece of analysis. And so maybe we should spend a little bit more time listening to people. I mean, you know, that's the other thing that I've sort of reflected on. You know, some of the really, really big transformational events that have happened in history have happened as a result of the views and findings of individuals, not necessarily of great organizations, of great shifts, but of brilliant individuals. You know, the guy who invented the internet, you know, these transformational things are, and so we should be on the lookout for people who do some extraordinary things and think about that. And you touched on the question of the environment. So there's a bit about control, there's a bit about reflection, there's a bit about listening. But I think what I want to encourage in cultures that still have this enormous stigma around mental ill health, I do want to try and encourage leaders within organizations to try and change their attitude towards it, because unless the leaders change their attitude, then other people won't. And one of the things I guess that I'm most proud of at HSF at the moment is that not only have partners spoken out publicly about their mental health challenges, but so have business services, so have secretaries, so have associates, so have trainees. They've recorded videos that have been shared with 6,000 members of HSF globally, and they were willing, A, to do it because they felt the culture was accepting of it, and B, I think most brave of all, to believe that it would not affect their careers. And that for me has been transformation. And I looked at a piece of research produced by the World Health Organization, which only had data from Western Europe and the US, and didn't have sufficient data from the rest of the world. But what that indicated was that nearly 50% of the reasons that people take time off work were for mental health reasons, not for physical health reasons. And that ought to be a wake-up call to all of those people who are suffering, that we can do something about it. It ought to be also a wake-up call to owners of businesses and law firms in particular, because that's what we're talking about here, to recognize that actually, if they can build an environment where people feel safer, better, and that their mental health issues are taken account of, they could also build much more resilient and actually much more ultimately profitable organizations. Because if you have a community of people who are fully engaged and are not struggling, you are going to have a community that is outperforming the work of others who haven't engaged in that mission.
So that's so true. I think the WHO report is also clearly specifying that if the mental health issue is addressed, it's going to be a very serious saving on the economy. And that number is very, very significant part of global GDP. So I think that's the significant aspect of the mental health to be taken care of. But I'm really glad to know that in your society, in your firm, people are coming out and talking about, and their careers are not stake merely because they have come out in open. This is a very, very good thing to hear. I think in Indian context, it's not so easy to my understanding. If we see purely from legal profession point of view, one set of lawyers are working in law firms and the other are working in courts. In law firms, I don't know if we have any kind of policy adopted by these law firms in India where they can recognize that, yes, there is a mental health issue with a one particular individual in the firm and how it is to be dealt with. And assuming the person is dealing on his own that mental health issue, whether his career is protected or not, I don't know, but I don't think there is any serious thought to it in the law firms to my mind. Second aspect is if we go to the court lawyers, we have at the top very successful lawyers who are working on their own, but I think 99% of lawyers are struggling around India to have their daily meal earned out of whatever they're doing on a regular basis. So I think there is no so-called of social security for such lawyers. One, it's very stigmatic for them to come out because they think that they would lose their practice if they come out open and tell that they have some serious mental health issue. So therefore, disclosure is a problem there. And assuming somebody is forced by his circumstances to come out, I think there is no backup for protecting his livelihood or taking care that he can be, after his revival, can be brought back into the profession. So therefore, that aspect is not available. So in Indian context, I think I'm sure that the people who are in position can come together. And I think since you have raised this issue and once this is seen by people, this is going to be certainly talked around. I would like to that to happen. And the leaders in the profession have responsibility that somehow, acknowledging that yes, this can be a problem. And second, there can be some collective effort to deal with this aspect and to support people who are willing to come out of this. I think certainly these are takeaways I think are very relevant from your talk coming out. I would like to know from your side, MQ mental health. I never knew before I read this research report from this.
Balbir, can I just very quickly, two very quick observations on
Sure.
That really important point you raised. Number one is that there has definitely been some movement in the Indian law firm community around trying to address mental health issues. Now, because I've had discussions with firms around some progress. What I don't know is where that's got to. In other words, how meaningful it is in practice. But there has been some movement. That's one positive, but work to do. And of course, there's work to do with HSF as well. The second point is that it is extraordinary how quick cultures can change. Because I certainly would have said to you 4 years ago, 3 years ago maybe, I think it would be very, very rare indeed for an associate or a trainee or somebody from business services to put their hand up and say, I'm struggling. And so it's only a very recent phenomena in the UK that we've seen these changes. We've seen some changes in Australia, and we've seen some changes in other offices globally. But it's been a really recent change. So let's celebrate the fact that cultures can change quickly if the leaders of this profession are determined to make a difference.
No, I completely agree, Chris. And we have a very, very bright set of people who are very senior partners in the firm and very senior on the litigation side. I think we are very, very sensible people. And I think it's about putting the idea in front of everyone and to see that if collectively something can be done for the profession, I think that's going to be a wonderful thing to contribute towards at least our professional fellow colleagues in that sense. I was coming to your another initiative where you're partnering with, which is MQ Mental Health Research, which is another charity you are very seriously involved in. Before I read about them, I never knew that the data on mental health can be so helpful in dealing with this problem at any level. How the research is being carried out and how the data is being first accumulated and used for dealing with the mental health aspect at MQ mental health level. I mean, you can throw some light on that.
Yeah, I guess just a few observations. Number one, it's much to my surprise when I joined the organization, mental health research has not been very extensive, and it has been something of the sort of Cinderella research category. So, you know, you only have to look at the developments that have been made in heart disease or cancer to see what extraordinary benefits can be gained from understanding these conditions so much better. So to my amazement, the whole question of mental health research is something that has not been undertaken in anything like the numbers, the detail, the spectrum that you might think, given its global impact. And I hope that MQ, to begin with, in its own small way, can start making a difference in that area. I mean, you know, its dream, of course, is to use research to understand mental health better, and
right.
ideally, you know, to try and, just as they're doing with cancer, to try and properly address it and to reduce its incidence, and in a perfect world, to rid the world of it completely. And we commission brilliant scientists in different places around the world to do research on different areas. There is so much to look at that you know, it's going to take some time. And you know, when I look at cancer research, for example, you know, that's been in existence for at least 40 years. And is one of the biggest research funders in the UK at the moment, and one of the biggest globally. And we need to get that kind of support behind mental health research for it to start having the sort of impact that we all want it to have. I mean, you know, for example, one person I know in Ireland at Trinity University is looking at why is it that medication works for some people and talking therapies work for other people. You know, what is it about the brain that means that, you know, and what is it about a certain type of medication that works well for, you know, person A as opposed to person B. And, you know, if we can have a better understanding of that, because I know for a lot of people, there's a bit of a lottery in terms of what medication they're given, and ultimately ends up working. And I think I was very fortunate in that very early on, the question of something to help the production of serotonin in my brain was something that would work well for me, and it has worked well for me. So I think the main message is it's early days, but it's an area that is badly underfunded and in desperate need of research to help make some inroads into something that is so prevalent. I mean, I think it's worth sharing that, and perhaps won't surprise you, but the legal profession sadly outperforms pretty much any other profession when it comes to mental ill health.
Oh, really?
Yes, I think there's, and again, you know, it would be very interesting to understand the research around that. Is it that the legal profession attracts the sort of people who have vulnerability? In other words, you know, is it that sort of thoughtful, careful, analytical type individual that is likely to be more susceptible? Or is it the nature of the job with the pressures that it brings, the expectations that it brings, that the buck stops with the lawyer. Is it that causes, you know, the mental ill health in a way that outperforms other professions, or is it a combination of those two things? You know, it would be nice to know the answer to that.
I think there was a brief statement by this Law Care charity, which is, I believe, a mental health charity for lawyers in UK.
Yeah.
They recently had an article in Financial Times, and they were attributing, saying the larger reason for stress among lawyers is purely because of the work culture, because of the pay gap between the different level of hierarchy of lawyers, and then the long working hours, and then feeling of being left alone. I mean, they were attributing, these were the factors I think largely young lawyers feel stressed about. And I think that's a fundamental factor. But you're right, I think it requires a furthermore research and analysis to deduce factors which are contributing towards, if you are saying such a significant numbers in legal profession who are facing mental health issues. I think it's really concerning to that extent. Do you see that after this pandemic, we don't know when we will be back to our offices and so-called normal? In India, we have not seen courts since last weeks. Otherwise, you are there in the courts at least 6-7 hours of the day, which means that the world is not going to be so-called normal very soon, which means that we will not be in courts again very soon. Do you see any silver lining in it, that it is going to bring in certain attributes which are going to stay with us for longer? Simply like in UK as well as in India, we have started online courts, and which is very new for Indian courts, where courts have started taking hearings on online through the media. We are using Zoom channels and other internet connecting platforms. Do you see this is sustainable? And especially since my feedback is that UK courts are doing fairly well on this aspect. Although in India, we are still in the process of coming up with the SOPs, and we need to see how it's going to progress in coming weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, look, great question. I think part of the answer is it depends how long the very unusual circumstances that we're in at the moment continue for. So I think, as I said, if it's a relatively short time, human beings have remarkably short memories, you know, and I just go back and mention the financial crisis and AIDS and HIV. You know, the world suddenly just carried on as before. So I think if the thing is relatively short, I think we will see not so many changes. And then I think at the other extreme, if things go on for a very long time, I think we could get to a position where we have to reimagine what it is like to live as a human being on this planet. Right. And that is both exciting and very scary. And I had some very amusing thoughts around, one of the dangers as human beings, we've talked a little bit about, success and fame and for all of that sort of stuff. And of course, comes with that is that we have this, in some ways, bad characteristics of wanting to, show off to our neighbors that we've been successful by having the sort of the outward trappings of success. And what does that mean? Do we have designer handbags? Do we wear Hermes ties? Do we have handmade suits? Do we drive, Ferraris? All of those things. If we're living in this new tight-knit lockdown world, suddenly those things will seem rather less important, because I'm not going to be wandering around the fields in deepest Kent in my Hermes tie and my handmade suit. They don't become important anymore. And so we have to reimagine, we almost have to imagine a world upside down and different, living in much smaller communities. And it sort of reminded me a little bit of that simple village life that I so often saw on both my walks and my cycles. And actually there were aspects of that simplicity which, as long as your basic needs are met, you know, as long as you're fed, as long as you are healthy, and if you're not healthy, you can get, you know, the support you need to get healthy. As long as those basic needs are met, actually life can become both simple and fulfilling and rewarding, and they can build communities which can lead to an extraordinarily fulfilling life. So that's the other extreme. The other extreme is that we live in a world that so changes that we have to reimagine what it is to be a human being on this world. And I think faith plays a really big part of that, and I could develop that. So that's what, and then there's the stuff in the middle. And then the stuff in the middle is the sort of stuff that you've quite rightly talked about, which is, can we take away lessons from what we're learning at the moment and deploy them in our ongoing lives? Now, if we can develop systems whereby court hearings can be done like you and I are chatting now, in a much more efficient way, what I wouldn't want to see is all of those same inefficiencies that we see in jurisdictions around the world being replicated online, because that gets us nowhere. So I think we need to be sure that whatever we're taking forward is helpful and efficient and adds something, as opposed to simply replicating something else. I do think that we will, you know, assuming that we do go back to work, people will, certainly to begin with, have a rather different view of office life and work culture, in the sense that I think they'll be very happy, many people, to be back, to be able to meet up with friends and give them a hug, to work physically as a team as opposed to remotely as a team. That's not to say that we haven't been able to prove that we can remote work. And I know that the Reliance Jio Facebook deal was pretty much executed. The whole thing was executed remotely, which is just remarkable.
Absolutely.
The moving parts that are relevant to a deal of that nature, you know, whether it's due diligence, whether it's the investment piece, whether it's the commercial agreements lying underneath that, and for everyone to be joined up in a way that didn't mean that you're locked in a room to say, get this done. But there's something important about that human connection. And I can give you an example at a very granular level, which is that, you know, we've been living, so I've been at home with my wife and my youngest son, who's studying to be a doctor, and my daughter, who is doing online classes at school and things. So she's just 14, so she's much younger than my boys. But my middle son, who is an actor come PE physical trainer, personal trainer, does online classes and all the rest of it, and he's been ill, so he's had the virus and is therefore now in a good place, because he's hopefully, the medics think that once you've had it, you won't get it again. So he lives in London and has cycled home to be with us for a week or 10 days. And I can't tell you how pleased I was to see him and to be able to actually touch him and hug him and to have a conversation with him, not over a screen like this, but in real time. And there's something very different. So I think one of the silver linings is that we will, I hope, if restrictions reduce significantly, we will embrace our ability to genuinely link in communities in a way that we took for granted, or in fact, even worse, we said, you know, that's not what we want, it's awful, you know, I would love to be able to work from home the whole time, because I think the majority of people need some boundaries, and I think the whole work piece provides it provides a world that we haven't yet adjusted to, and I think you then need to revisit the whole. What does the world look like from our level if this were to go on?
Right. Yesterday my daughter said one thing. She said that I don't like about masks, everybody wearing masks. I said, it's safe. What's the problem? She said, I can't see anybody smile. It was such innocuous things to say, but realistically, that's the one way a human can connect to other. And if you don't see those expressions of smile, I think it's very difficult to connect with someone. And otherwise, it's so easy, just somebody smiling at you and you wave your hand and then you know the person. I think that's so easy. But I completely agree. I think we need to learn to live in boundaries. There are going to be certain changes the way we go out, we meet people. But I don't think humans can give up their basic touch and feel requirement on a social level. And we sincerely hope that we see that in a shorter time rather than what the experts are predicting. Chris, you've been extremely brave in what you have stated today. And I'm very sure the moment our talk is out, you are going to receive a number of calls on your well-being. And nobody is going to believe that how sane, how rational you are, and still something is going inside you which needs care and concern. I really wish you a good time ahead, Chris, and healthy and with complete peace. I would love to see you back in the office. And next time, whenever I'm in London, we are due to share our experiences, because by the time we meet each other after this talk, we'll have a lot to see that what we discussed and how the world has shaped up. So this is going to be an interesting meeting, seeing you in London. I really thank you once again. And any message you want to send to any specific person or in journal, I would be happy to carry that.
Look, I think the main message is that if people in India are struggling, and particularly lawyers, given this is the community that you and I are very much focused on, if they're anxious, they're frightened, they're concerned, please understand you're not on your own, and that I in particular really empathize with what you're going through at the moment. And maybe in fact, Lord Raj Lumba, who established the Lumba Foundation,
right.
And who I raise money for through my bike ride and my walk, very sweetly, because he heard that I wasn't so well, and he called my wife, and he said, I think the reason that Chris is depressed is he can't go back and see his friends in India. So maybe that's the reason. Maybe
I would completely agree with him. I completely agree with him. Chris, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you, and say hi to Debbie from my side, and hope to see both of you sometime. Bye and take care.
Thanks so much. Okay, God bless.
Thank you very much.